Hello and welcome back to the second part of my question and answer video. If you haven't seen part one, I've included a link above and in the description below. Once again, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel by subscribing, watching, sharing, liking and leaving comments. But my special thanks again go to the channel members for their regular support. It makes a huge difference. And if you'd like to support the channel, please do also consider signing up. I've put a link above and in the description below. In the meantime, here's this week's first question. Raza Hassan asks, do you think that creating an independent Palestinian state is possible? Yes, just about. It's extremely difficult to see how, as things stand, you would create a Palestinian state. I mean, of course, recognizing that most of the world already recognizes an independent Palestinian state. We've seen this, even more and more European Union members do. But in real terms, and this is what I think, you're getting at, can we see that? So look, the principles of statehood, the standard principles are, a state has a defined territory, a settled population, the ability to enter into relations with other states, and governance. So, or effective governance, I think, is the really important point. We know that it's got a settled population. We know that it's got an ability to enter into relations with other states. Does it have an effective independent governance at the moment? It's very questionable because a lot of its ability to act is obviously limited by Israel. And of course, you've got a defined territory. Does it have a defined territory that it can exercise control over? So we know what the defined territory of a Palestinian state should be. I mean, this is 1967 borders. But in reality, through Israeli settlement in the West Bank, that is very, very difficult to envisage. That how do you create a logical, viable Palestinian state there? And I think that this is a huge, huge problem, and a problem that's going to have to be answered, I think, when we get to the end of the war in Gaza. So one argument is that, well, potentially Gaza could become a nascent Palestinian state, but that's not going to be enough to manage the West Bank as well. And I did a video, I'll put a link above, that looks at what happened, some of the planning that might be thought of for establishing Gaza, after the war, as a potentially independent, viable entity, basis of a Palestinian state along with the West Bank. But I think that this is it's really difficult to see at the moment, and especially with the current Israeli government that is so clearly opposed to a two-state settlement. And where is the international pressure going to come from in order to put this into action? But again, I think that unless it happens, we're just going to see a continuation of much of the violence we're seeing at the moment. And I think, and I use this very advisedly, that, if Israel wants to continue to exercise the control it has over the West Bank, and remembering, of course, there was this landmark International Court of Justice ruling just a few weeks ago, which actually clearly said that Israel had violated international law by effectively, it has annexed large parts of the West Bank, contrary to UN Security Council resolutions, contrary to international law. But where is the pressure going to come from Israel to step back and withdraw those? It's just very, very difficult to see. So it's not looking particularly positive, unfortunately, at the moment for the creation of a Palestinian state. And I have to be very clear. I mean, before anyone sort of wants to read where my positions might lie on this, I am absolutely, I fully support the idea of an independent, secure Israel. But I also fundamentally believe in an independent, secure Palestinian state as well, and that the two living side by side, it's not an easy relationship. It's not going to be one that, the legacy of the past is going to be easy to overcome. But I absolutely convinced that, what we have to see is the basis for a two-state solution that has been laid out put into action according to the 1967 borders. So, but how we get there, it's incredibly difficult to see. So do I think that creating an independent Palestinian state is possible? Yes, but only just. Eugene Gvozdetsky asks, was it legally consistent for the United Nations to accept Russia as the successor to the Soviet Union's seat, while rejecting Serbia and Montenegro's claim to Yugoslavia's seat, given that Russia seceded from the USSR, whereas Serbia and Montenegro didn't secede from Yugoslavia? So, Eugene, thank you very much for such an interesting question. And this really does get into an area that I'm particularly interested in, which is about state creation and secessionist movements, and how, when a country collapses, the different parts of it that might go on and become independent states are recognized and accepted on the world stage. And I think this really does highlight a very interesting two particular cases that happened at roughly the same sort of time. But as you point out, there were very, very different reactions to it. And I think what we also have to bear in mind is that there's a legal and a political dimension that often comes in with recognition. I think in the case of the Soviet Union, what we saw was essentially, although the Soviet Union had put up resistance to the collapse, it had initially rejected the independence of the Baltic republics. By the time we got to the end of 1991, December 1991, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, there was a general acceptance and consensus that Russia was going to be the successor state. And in actual fact, you use the term successor, but formally speaking, there's actually two different words that we use. So officially, Russia is actually the continuator state to the Soviet Union. It continued the Soviet Union's membership in the United Nations, and I think there was a very good reason for it. I think Russia was far and away the most significant member of the Soviet Union. It was also a question of Russia or the Soviet Union being a permanent member of the Security Council. So there was a real sense that it would be helpful to have a clear indication of which country was going to continue to play that essential, that pivotal role in the Security Council. And so Russia, by the acceptance of the other republics, took on that role. And it was actually fairly uncontentious. It was widely accepted that Russia should continue to play on that role. In the case of Yugoslavia, we saw a very different set of circumstances. I think, although we saw conflicts when the Soviet Union broke up, they tended to be very localized. There wasn't actually, if you like, a major war that was fought by particular republics. I mean, there was a tough crackdown on, for example, the Baltic republics as they tried to break away, but it didn't lead to a war, as happened in the case of Yugoslavia. And I think, and this is a point that I often bring up, I think the international community had decided that because the way that Yugoslavia was breaking up, because it had descended into violence, there was a sense that the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia no longer existed. And this was accepted by the Security Council. And so the decision was taken that none of the republics would then be considered the continuator state. In actual fact, all of them would be new states. So even though Serbia and Montenegro, which remained in a political union, remained in the political union until 2006, although they claimed to be the continuator of the SFRY as the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, that wasn't in fact accepted. And so the decision was made that it would have to apply as a new member in the same way that the other republics that had broken away had done. So we're talking about Slovenia, we're talking about Croatia, we're talking about what is now North Macedonia, but originally was admitted as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. We're talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, and later on, Montenegro. But in that case, it was a very, very different set of dynamics. And I think one of the things that I think we also need to bear in mind is that At the time the decision was made, there was a great deal of anger at the way that Serbia in particular had behaved, and that I think that there are a lot of points that we can talk about in the breakup of Yugoslavia. It's a very complex story. There's a lot of mistakes that were made, but I often think back that, and one of these conversations, that I really would like, or I try to have with many in Serbia, is they've lost sight at the tremendous damage that the behavior of Slobodan Milosevic at that time did. And I think that had it been handled very differently, had what we saw in Yugoslavia mirrored what had happened in the Soviet Union, I think there would have probably been a much better case that Serbia could have said to the other republics, look, fine, go your own way. We're happy to let that happen, but we want to be considered a continuator state. And I think had that been the case, had it also been the case that, there wasn't this support from Belgrade for secessionist movements within those other republics, then I think that we could have potentially seen a very, very different story. And it might have paralleled what happened between the Soviet Union and Russia. And we'd seen the same in Yugoslavia. But it's a great question, and it really does actually highlight, a very, very interesting aspect of all of this. And it shows that although you can take legal positions on these issues, there are also very, very interesting political debates. And it's not just about the politics of important countries sort of retaining that seat in the Security Council, but it's also about international opinion about the way that a country is breaking up and how that should be responded to. Frostakak asks, are there any specific secession movements that you expect we'll be hearing a lot about in the coming years? So this is a great question, and I think it's one of those questions that if you'd asked me this 3 or 4 years ago, I'd have given you a very different answer to the answer I'm about to give you. And I think that we are at the moment at a phase in international relations where there is a particular caution about secessionist movements and lending support to them. I think the international environment really does work against them. And of course, that boils down to the key issue of what we're seeing in Ukraine, that we have a war here where you have a degree of separatism. I think we need to be very careful because obviously it's a lot more complicated than that. And obviously this is, as many, and certainly I believe, essentially a Russian territory grab. But nevertheless, we have a situation at the moment where I think that there is a lot of international caution about being seen to endorse breakaway movements. And so I think the bar has really been raised considerably for secessionist movements. It's a lot more difficult for them at the moment. And I think that we're seeing this in all sorts of cases. I think, there is a lot of movements which would have appealed previously for international support, and that international support just isn't there at the moment, that nobody wants to be seeing, being seen to endorse this at a time, certainly when Western countries are supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity. I think when we deal with a lot of other parts of the world, they've tended to be a little bit more, well, not a little bit, actually considerably more suspicious and skeptical about secessionist movements anyway. As I often point out, we have to bear in mind that the vast majority of countries actually aren't homogenous, that they do have minorities of one sort or another, whether those are religious minorities, whether those are national minorities. And so they've tended to take a much more cautious position when it comes to separatism and secessionist movements. And again, as I say, I think that what we're seeing at the moment in Ukraine has really made everyone a lot more nervous about being seen to endorse that. So I think, for movements that are trying to push for independence at the moment, it's particularly difficult to get the traction that they need. So to come back to your specific question about, are there any particular secessionist movements that I expect to see and hearing a lot about in the coming years, I think we are at a stage at the moment where there isn't a lot. I don't think there's a lot of interest in being seen to endorse these or support them. And it's just a sort of sense that I have that it's a particularly difficult time, as I say, for a lot of these movements to get the traction, to get the support that they might want. And I think a lot of countries will certainly be treating it with a lot of caution at the moment. So as I say, there are different territories that are clearly pushing for independence, where it isn't completely dead as an idea. You've got those movements in established democracies, for example. So I think, we'll still hear talk about independence for Scotland. There might be a degree of it for places like Catalonia, for Flanders. But I'm not expecting that we're going to see a flurry of independence movements succeed. Not that they have, in actual fact. I mean, as I'm very fond of saying, I think there's only one truly successful independence movement since 1945, where a territory has unilaterally broken away and gone on and become a full member of the United Nations, and that was Bangladesh in 1971. I mean, the closest other that we've got to that is Kosovo. But, even now, 15 years after it declared independence, it's still not a member of the United Nations. So I think, it was always a very high bar. But as I say, I think with everything that's going on in Ukraine at the moment, it's become even tougher for a lot of these groups that are trying to get independence. Achad Chowdhury asks, does the African Union have a bright, united future like the European Union? Achad, this is a really fascinating question, because I think the European Union in many ways has set a model that I think a lot of regions around the world are actually looking to and sort of thinking, is this something that we can emulate? And I think, it's really interesting to see how the African Union, which, has actually changed its name. I mean, it started off, Organization of African Unity, which actually has then become the African Union and modelled itself, if you like, on the European Union. And in actual fact, I mean, there's all sorts of different elements that it's paralleled with the European Union. But I think we also need to understand, I mean, the extent and the way that the European Union operates, and whether that's something that the African countries would really want to try and emulate and would really want to try and follow. Because, I mean, there is a very, very high degree of integration within the European Union. And what essentially it means, and I often try and make this point, is that the European Union is essentially built on a sense of shared destiny, political cooperation, economic cooperation, but it's also built on a rule of law. And it essentially boils down to the fact that, for example, something like the single market, which is at the bedrock in many ways of the European Union, is based on the idea that if you invest or if you sell to another European Union country and you run into any problems, that that European Union law will be effectively applied in that country, and that if you have to go to court against somebody from that country, that you can go before the court and you're going to be given a fair hearing. And this is a reason why when the European Union accession process is so tough, and I very often hear people say, well, why don't we take in the Western Balkans? They can get themselves ready once they're in the European Union. It would be such an important political move. And I always push back on it for this particular reason, because it's so important that functions and functions effectively and functions fairly, and so that everyone understands that those rules are applied. Now, the point is, can you see that happening in Africa at the moment? And are countries, African countries, willing to give up their sovereignty and pool it in the way that the European Union countries have? And that's not to say it can't happen or there's any intrinsic reasons why it can't happen. But I think it does raise some very interesting and important questions about how that sense of sovereignty is understood in other parts of the world, and that whether there is a particular historical experience in Europe which is driving it in the particular direction that it's going. And whether that can be emulated in Africa. And remember, the European Union started off with 6 members. It grew gradually. It's now at 27 members. It obviously reached a high of 28 before Britain left. Getting that degree of coherence and accepted when you've already got so many countries that are already in the African Union to all agree to accept that pooled sovereignty in that case, it raises some important questions. And, it's not something that can't happen. But whether that debate can really come through and sort of build up in the way that the European Union is, I don't think we're there at the moment. I think, my sense is that it's all for the good. I think, breaking down the sort of barriers, opening up freedom of movement, for example, I think making sure that, so we've got within Europe, for example, the single market, the idea that Africa would have the same, that you get rid of trading tariffs and things and that you open up their economies much more, can only be for good. And, I'm a great supporter of it. And remembering, of course, we're not just talking about Africa. I mean, ASEAN in many ways in Southeast Asia, many argue is also a model for the European Union. And I think, that is another great example. But you then have to, as I say, balance that against these ideas of sovereignty, about the getting agreement amongst so many countries, especially in the case of the African Union. So I would like to think that it's got a bright, united future like the European Union, notwithstanding the fact that the EU has its problems and it isn't perfect by any means, and there's, a lot that still needs to be done. But I would like to think that it does, but I just don't think that we're there at the moment. There's a lot of promise there, but there's a lot more that would need to be done. And I just don't think the African countries, are thinking in those terms at the moment to be able to go down the path of the European Union. But, as I say, one would hope that's something that will happen in the future. Vlad Tevez asks, does international law, the UN Charter and the Security Council resolutions still matter against hard power? So, Vlad, thank you very much for this question. I think this is something that I think a lot of us who believe in the United Nations believe that it's still essential for international order, notwithstanding all its flaws, notwithstanding the problems that it has. And I think anyone who works on the United Nations understands those flaws, those shortcomings, but also recognises that the UN is still an incredibly important institution and provides and does a lot of good, even with those shortcomings. But it's becoming more and more difficult to see how the UN can stand against some of the trends that we're watching in international relations at the moment. And I think, regular viewers will know that I have been really very critical about the erosion of international law, not just with what we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine, but I've also been extremely concerned about the erosion of international law by many Western states in the past 2 or 3 decades, that I think a lot of countries have sort of felt, that the UN has put up constraints and that they should just be free to act. So I think a lot of this, we saw, for example, in the 1990s when there was a lot of talk about humanitarian intervention. And yes, I think, we can recognize that this is extremely important. But at the same time, when you start to bend international law, when you start to break international law, even for the best reasons, then you open the way for others to follow. And I think that this is one of the tragedies that we've actually seen, that it's not just now we're in a phase where Western countries are saying, well, you know what, we're witnessing a truly terrifying breakdown of international law and it's been challenged. And I don't think enough Western policymakers are willing to stand up and say, look, and we have to also take responsibility for leading us to this place. Quite where we go from here, how we solve this, is a huge problem. And I don't think anyone's got a good answer for it. And this is what really, really worries me. And part of the reason why, again, I've been so outspoken on the Russia-Ukraine war and why I believe that Russia needs to be defeated. Because I believe that if Russia wins, then we have dealt potentially a fatal blow to that international law. So defeating Russia is important, but then we also need to have a think about how international law will function and how all countries can then be held accountable. And this, might then come into the question of what do we do about international law? What do we do about bolstering the UN Charter, the Security Council? Rediscovering the value of the UN and rediscovering the need to actually stand by the terms of the UN, even when it might be uncomfortable for certain countries, and including Western countries, which say this ties our hands. Yes, it ties our hands, but it also ties the hands of others. And so we really do need to stand by this. And I think that this has been lost sight of in the past and opened the door for a lot of the problems that we have now. So, I think that I'd like to think that international law, the UN Charter, the Security Council resolutions, still matter against hard power. But it's very, very, we're entering a phase where that is becoming increasingly challenged. And as I say, I'm not quite sure how we find our way back to it, but I certainly believe that somehow we have to. And this idea that others have sort of brought up that, we need to get beyond the UN, I think would be an absolute disaster. I mean, it has its flaws, its imperfections. There is a lot that could be done to sort of improve matters. But the idea that we could, the world would be better without the UN, or that it could somehow be disbanded and a new organization created, not a hope. That getting the consensus, the international consensus for a new organization to replace the UN would be impossible. And then, if you create an alternative such as a UN of democracies, for example, well, that has no ability to bring in countries that aren't democratic or aren't Western or whatever it would be created. So you're just actually hardening the divisions that are emerging in international politics. So in actual fact, as I say, for all the problems the UN has, I think we need to make sure that it remains intact. But this onslaught of hard power, this almost return to the 19th century realpolitik, is something that I think is worrying all I think all serious international observers, and especially those that actually do believe that international law should remain paramount. Nearly Epic asks, do you have any suggestions as to what the alternative global order that China is proposing would look like? This is something that I think, looking at the world order at the moment, and there is all the discussion about China effectively becoming the main challenger to the United States, to the West. And I think there is a real question about if that is going to see a change in the international system, what would it look like? Because I don't think we've got a clear idea. Certainly there isn't a clear ideology. And we get into very, very strange territory on this, because in many ways, China is a country that has emerged and taken a particular direction over the past 2 or 3 decades. So I'm very fond of saying that when I first got into international relations, China was very inward looking. It was very suspicious of the outside world. It was far more concerned about the outside world wanting to know what it was doing internally than it was interested in wanting to understand the outside world. And that has radically changed. So China now engages much more actively in all sorts of ways. We've seen the way that it invests, and often very controversially, in other countries. China now takes part in UN peacekeeping operations, for example. Its Belt and Road Initiative is a very clear engagement, economic, political, diplomatic engagement with a whole range of countries, across Asia and Europe and Africa. So we've seen China sort of develop, but at the same time, in many ways, traditionally, China has actually been rather conservative in how that it's sort of looked at international order. So for example, it's tended to be very opposed to secession, partly because obviously it's question of Taiwan. That has made sure that it's tended to work against secessionist movements and hasn't got that sort of history of supporting them that we might have seen from at other times. So it's a really, really interesting question as to what China is proposing and what it would look like. I can't say that I've got a clear answer for what we're talking about. I think one of the things, though, that has been rather worrying is the way that China has responded to the war in Ukraine and siding with Russia. I think that, this has raised a lot of questions about what China, how deeply embedded its views, for example, on territorial change are. So I think, that's been something which has raised all sorts of questions that in times past you might have expected China to either say, look, this isn't our fight, we're just not interested, or else have been rather more critical of what Russia is doing. But, I think we can see that China does see Russia as a useful ally, at least for the moment, in various ways, that this is sort of challenging the West. And I think it's probably hedging its bets and seeing where it can go. But I think certainly in terms of if its power continues to rise, what sort of world that we're looking at in the second half of the 21st century as a result of it, I think is a really, really great question. I just don't think that we've got a clear picture at the moment. But of course, I'd love to hear other views on this. So please in the comments below, do let me know what you're thinking. It would be fascinating to hear. But certainly at the moment, I think we're all looking at it sort of not sure exactly what it means, that we know China is becoming more significant, but what really underpins that? What's its philosophy as it becomes this sort of much more significant world power? It's not entirely clear, as I say, for all sorts of reasons. It's more complex, I think, than many outsiders might present it as being. So, Marco Pinterich asks, to what extent can the EU, Europe, protect itself without the help of the United States? What are the trends for the future? Marco, thank you very much for this great question, because I think this is something that obviously has come very much to the fore of debate, especially in the past year as we're running up to the next US presidential elections. And of course, as many of you are aware, I made a video looking at NATO and in light of threats or suggestions that if Donald Trump wins and returns to the presidency in the United States, there's a possibility that the United States could pull out of NATO. And I think that this, even if it isn't as drastic as that, assuming that Trump wins, I think there is a much greater debate that we're seeing in Europe about the fact that Europe needs to be thinking much more actively about its own defence needs, about what it can do to help itself in the event that we see, as I say, the United States sort of withdraw from NATO or certainly become a lot less active in it. I think we've clearly seen, certainly prior to the Ukraine war, that defence expenditure in Europe was far below what it should have been. And, I think we certainly have seen a reversal of that. I think there is now a much greater understanding amongst the European countries that something has got to be done and that they've got to increase their defence spending. But what I think has also been very interesting is the Ukraine war has strengthened NATO. I think, before that, we were probably seeing a lot more debate within the European Union about the EU doing things for themselves. Ukraine war comes along, and I think it's actually sort of done a lot for US standing in the world as well in many ways, because I think especially after the chaos of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan early on in the Biden presidency, there was a real sense that was this the moment that US power had finally waned. And I think that in many ways has been reversed. I think, during the Ukraine war, the US has actually resumed a position of leadership in the West. So we're caught in a really strange time that, while Europe has been thinking much more about its own defence, the United States, I think, has become a lot more significant once again in a lot of those debates. But maybe now we also need to be thinking, and so a lot is going to be riding on the outcome of the election in the United States. And European decision makers will be thinking a lot about this at the moment. They'll obviously be waiting and seeing. We've had the potentially major shift with Biden dropping out of the race and replaced by Kamala Harris, and what we're going to be seeing, what that might mean in terms of the result. And I think the general feeling is if she wins, then I think there will continue to be a strengthening of that transatlantic relationship. But obviously, if Donald Trump wins again, then there will be some very, very serious questions, about what Europe can do and how much can it really protect itself without the help of the USA. And I think, as I say, it's going to be something that is going to be on a lot of people's minds in the next few months, depending on what happens with the result of the elections in the US. Jumper Bomber asks, do you think the EU can survive in the long run, given the huge differences in its members' geopolitical and economical interests? Yes, I do. I think that there are indeed some differences. I think by and large, what unites the countries of the European Union far outweighs any differences they have. And of course, look, we have certain countries which have become very problematic. And I think, we all can recognise that Hungary is a particular problem at the moment. Poland was a problem for a while as well. It had a very different outlook. And of course, as the European Union grows, we will occasionally find problems of this sort that emerge. But I think by and large, the EU members are able to recognise the value of the European Union and all that it gives them in so many other ways. But one thing that I remember many years ago reading a really interesting discussion on the success of the United States, which essentially said the US became successful when the different parts of the US were able to recognize that they contributed different things to the Union. And I think that this is very much the same with the European Union. The idea that, the EU will never succeed if every member state is expected to perform the same role. That's just not how unions work. In any case, you can look within countries, you can see some parts of the country are wealthier than others, some more developed, some have some strategic value that other parts don't have. And I think it's recognizing that in the European Union. If you want all the countries to be exactly the same and sort of make the same contributions, then that's going to lead to resentment and that's going to lead to problems. But when you actually start to recognize that, look, the EU is built on a number of different countries. They're very different from each other, but they all contribute to that union and they can all recognize the value of that union. Then I think things work a lot more effectively. So I think, my view remains that, in the long run, and the old saying about the long run, but certainly as things stand at the moment, I think talks of the demise of the European Union are greatly exaggerated, and I think especially after Brexit, just look at the degree to which support for leaving the European Union has dropped massively everywhere else in the European Union. They look at it, and I think it really has shown the degree to which it's so important, and that European unity actually provides all sorts of benefits for member states that far outweigh, as I say, certain occasional differences that will generate. But again, on the geopolitical side of things, there's a remarkable degree of cohesion. And on the economical, I think it's almost across the board that they accept the fundamental principles of the European Union and the value of having a thing like the single market, having the customs union, these sorts of things, and open trade, I think makes an enormous difference. Channel member Timor64 asks, are internationally recognised borders in the post-1945 system changeable by prosecuting a successful war? If, after the current war, Ukraine keeps part of Russia and Russia keeps part of Ukraine, will this upend the international system? So this is a really, really interesting question, because in essence, no. International law works on the basis that you can't conquer territory. That's a very 19th century view that you march in, you take the territory of a neighbouring state. Well, we control it. It's in our hands. that's that. There is now in the UN Charter the idea of the respect for the territorial integrity of member states. And so, this is a fundamental part of international law. And it's actually held up remarkably well. There are very, very few examples where territory has been annexed. But you then run into the problem of state sovereignty. And countries are allowed to determine their own borders. So essentially what you get here is, could a country voluntarily choose to give up part of its territory? Yes. Could it do that as part of a peace agreement? Yes. But would that not be seen as some form of coercion into having to accept that? And I think that this is the really big question. What happens if, Ukraine for any reason sues for peace and then Russia just says, all right, we're going to keep this territory. If Ukraine willingly gives it up, has it willingly given it up? I mean, it's a really, really interesting and quite a complex point that I'm not sure that we've got a clear-cut, certainly political answer. The lawyers might take a slightly different view on it, but, from a politics position, you get into difficult territory. And I think that, this is why there is this sort of sense that Russia needs to be defeated. It needs to be forced from Ukraine's territory, because if it does get into that situation where it prosecutes a successful war and manages then to keep hold of that territory, then it's going to sort of be raising some very, very uncomfortable questions. Now, I mean, what you could see and what could certainly happen is that Russia de facto controls it. So although Russia would argue that it's annexed it, that isn't recognized by the rest of the world and everything like that. We've already seen that. We've seen a number of examples where that sort of happens, that a country controls part of the territory but doesn't form, or even if it does formally claim it, the rest of the world says, well, that hasn't been agreed to, so we don't recognize that control. But I think in the case of Ukraine, this is something that would raise real questions. I don't think at the moment we are going to see anything like that. I think Ukraine's position is that this is still its sovereign territory, and it's more likely that we're going to end up in a frozen conflict, which could be perpetual. It could last a very, very long time, and we've seen that with other frozen conflicts. I mean, consider Transnistria. We could look at Abkhazia. We could look at South Ossetia in Georgia. So I think that, that's a more likely scenario. But we do, as I say, you raise a really, really interesting point about how, if we see territorial conquest then signed on the dotted line in a peace agreement, has force been used to reach that? And what does that say about the international system? I think that it would be very, very troubling, and would set a very dangerous precedent. But, again, look, this is something that it would be really interesting to hear people's thoughts in the comments on how they see this. Unfortunately, I think that's it for this video. I really hope that you've enjoyed it, and don't forget to watch the first part if you haven't already. And here's another video that you might also find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.